Hello everyone. I know you're here to use this video to help you sleep better, and I'm here to help you do just that. All you need to do is listen and relax. Before we begin, you can comment below and let me know where you're watching from. What time is it now? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to hear the next episodes. Now just relax. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. We had narrowly escaped a terrifying encounter, but the memory of that night would haunt me for years to come. My wife and I were on a road trip, just trying to get away for a bit and enjoy some time together. We had been driving for a while, and everything was going great until we noticed this truck behind us. At first, we didn't think much of it. I mean, it's not unusual to see other vehicles on the road, right? But as we kept driving, we started to realize that this truck wasn't just following us. It was tailgating us, getting closer and closer with each passing mile. I tried to shake it off by speeding up a bit and then slowing down, but no matter what I did, the truck stayed right on our tail like it was glued to our bumper or something. My wife started to get really freaked out, and I have to admit, I was starting to feel pretty nervous myself. I mean, who follows someone like that, especially out in the middle of nowhere? We decided to pull off the highway at the next exit, hoping to lose the truck in the maze of side streets and back roads. But no matter where we went, the truck was right there behind us, like it was playing some twisted game of cat and mouse. By this point, my heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the panic rising in my throat. I didn't know what this person wanted from us, but I knew we had to get away from them, and fast. We kept driving, trying to put as much distance between us and the truck as possible. My wife was on the phone with the police, but out here in the middle of nowhere, it felt like we were on our own. Finally, after what felt like hours of tense silence, we spotted a gas station up ahead. We pulled in, hoping that maybe the presence of other people would scare off our pursuer. But as we got out of the car and headed inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the truck parked out front, but it was nowhere to be seen. We hurried inside, trying to act casual, even though every instinct was screaming at us to run. My wife went to use the restroom while I paid for the gas, and I tried to keep an eye on the door, just in case. When my wife came out of the restroom, she was pale as a ghost. She whispered something to me, her voice barely audible over the sound of the cashier ringing up our purchase. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized what she was saying. The truck was parked outside, waiting for us. We were trapped, with nowhere to run and no one to help us. I quickly paid for the gas and grabbed my wife's hand, pulling her towards the door. We had to get out of there before whoever was in that truck caught up to us. We burst out of the gas station and ran to our car, throwing ourselves inside and slamming the door shut behind us. I started the engine and peeled out of the parking lot, not caring about the screeching tires or the startled looks of the people inside. As we sped away from the gas station, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the truck pulling out onto the road behind us, its headlights shining like the eyes of some predatory beast. But this time, we weren't going to let it catch us. We drove faster than we ever had before, pushing our car to its limits as we raced towards the safety of the nearest town. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of terror, we saw the lights of civilization up ahead. We pulled into the town, breathing a sigh of relief as we left our pursuer behind us. We called the police as soon as we arrived, reporting the truck and giving them as much information as we could. But by the time they arrived at the gas station, the truck was long gone, disappearing into the night like it had never been there at all. We never did find out who was driving that truck or what they wanted from us. But one thing's for sure, we'll never forget the terror of being followed, hunted like animals on the open road, and we'll never take another road trip without looking over our shoulders, wondering if our pursuer is still out there, waiting for us to let our guard down. Once again, I was home alone in my suburban house, enjoying the quiet solitude after the whirlwind of our wedding day. My husband had gone out of town for a business trip, leaving me to settle into our new home on my own. At first, I relished the chance to have some time to myself, But that all changed when I received a series of disturbing photographs in the mail. The first photograph arrived on a bright, sunny morning. It was a picture of me standing in the kitchen, making breakfast. At first, I dismissed it as a strange coincidence, but when the second photograph arrived later that day, I knew something was wrong. This time, the photograph showed me sitting on the couch watching TV. It was taken from outside the window, and I could see the reflection of the camera in the glass. My heart raced as I realized that someone had been watching me, capturing my every move without my knowledge. I called the police, but without any evidence of who was sending the photographs, there was little they could do. I tried to go about my day as normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, another photograph arrived. This time, it showed me getting ready for bed, taken from inside the house. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized that whoever was sending the photographs had been inside my home. I searched the house from top to bottom, but I found no sign of an intruder. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the eerie photographs as evidence of their presence. As the days passed, the photographs became more and more frequent. They showed me going about my daily routine, cooking, cleaning, sleeping. Each one a reminder that someone was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I became paranoid, jumping at every sound, constantly checking the locks on the doors and windows. I stopped leaving the house altogether, afraid of what might happen if I ventured outside. But no matter how careful I was, the photographs kept coming. Each one seemed to taunt me, mocking my attempts to uncover the identity of the person behind them. I reached out to friends and family for help, but no one had any answers. It was as if I was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. Then, one day, I received a final photograph. It was a close-up of my face, taken while I slept. The flash from the camera illuminated the darkness of the room, casting long shadows across the walls. I knew then that I had to confront whoever was behind the photographs, no matter the cost. With a sense of determination, I gathered my courage and ventured outside for the first time in weeks. As I made my way down the street, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. It was as if the eyes of the entire neighborhood were watching me, judging me for my perceived weakness. But I pushed through the fear, determined to uncover the truth. I knocked on doors, questioned neighbors, and searched for any clue that might lead me to the person responsible for the photographs. And then, just when I was about to give up hope, I found it. A small, nondescript house at the end of the street. It was the last place I had expected to find answers, but something about it drew me in, compelling me to investigate further. I approached the house cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached out to knock on the door, it swung open, revealing a figure standing in the shadows. It was my husband. At first, I couldn't believe my eyes. How could he be behind the photographs? But as he explained, it all began to make sense. He had been struggling with mental health issues for months, feeling isolated and alone in our new home. The photographs were his way of reaching out, of trying to connect with me in his own twisted way. I was stunned, overwhelmed by a flood of conflicting emotions. Part of me was relieved to finally have an explanation for the strange occurrences, but another part of me was angry. Angry that he had kept this secret from me, angry that he had put me through such torment. But as we talked, I began to see things from his perspective. He was hurting, lost in a sea of darkness with no lifeline to cling to, and in his desperation, he had turned to the only thing he knew, me. In the end, we both realized that we needed help. Help to heal, help to move forward, help to rebuild our relationship from the ground up. And though the road ahead would be long and difficult, I knew that as long as we had each other, we could weather any storm that came our way. As we stood there in the doorway, bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The nightmare was finally over, and we were free to begin anew. I was out hiking solo in the wilderness, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of nature. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I had been walking for hours, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of the wilderness. As I trudged along the narrow trail, my eyes caught sight of something in the distance. An old abandoned cabin nestled among the trees. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten by time. Curiosity piqued, I veered off the trail and made my way toward it. The cabin was weather-beaten and run down, but there was something strangely alluring about it. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. The interior was dark and musty, with dust motes dancing and the faint light filtering through the windows. It was clear that no one had lived here for a long time. I shivered, suddenly feeling a chill in the air. Despite the eerie atmosphere, I couldn't resist exploring further. I wandered through the rooms, running my fingers along the peeling wallpaper and cobweb-covered furniture. It was like stepping back in time. As I made my way to the back of the cabin, I stumbled upon a trapdoor hidden beneath a threadbare rug. My heart skipped a beat as I lifted the rug and peered into the darkness below. With a shaky breath, I descended into the cellar, the wooden steps creaking beneath my feet. The air was thick and musty, and a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. The cellar was small and cramped, with shelves lining the walls filled with jars of preserved food and dusty old books. But as I scanned the room, my eyes landed on something that made my blood run cold. A makeshift altar, adorned with candles and strange symbols. My heart raced as I realized I wasn't alone. Someone had been here, someone who practiced dark rituals in this remote cabin in the woods. Panic surged through me as I turned to leave, but before I could reach the stairs, I heard a sound behind me. A low, guttural growl that froze me in place. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw him. A man emerging from the shadows, his eyes wild with madness. I stumbled backward, my mind racing with fear. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips as he advanced toward me, a sinister smile playing on his lips. I knew I had to get out of there, to escape before it was too late. With every ounce of strength I had left, I turned and bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. I burst through the door and into the fading light of the setting sun, sprinting through the forest as fast as my legs could carry me. Branches clawed at my skin, and roots threatened to trip me up. But I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the trail. I didn't dare look back as I ran, the terror fueling my every step. It felt like hours before I finally emerged from the trees, gasping for breath and covered in sweat. But even as I collapsed on the ground, my heart still pounding with fear, I knew that I had escaped. I had survived the horror that lurked in the depths of the forest, and I would never forget the terror of that abandoned cabin. I'm a truck driver hauling freight across the country on a regular basis. It's a lonely job, spending long hours on the road with nothing but the hum of the engine and the endless stretch of highway to keep me company. But I never expected my latest delivery to turn into a nightmare. It was late at night when I pulled into a rest stop, the darkness swallowing the landscape like a thick blanket. I was tired and ready to call it a night, but I still had a long way to go before I reached my destination. As I climbed out of the cab and stretched my legs, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the parking lot. A lone hitchhiker, holding a sign that read West. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should offer the stranger a ride. There was something off about him, something that sent a shiver down my spine. But before I could make up my mind, the hitchhiker approached me, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. He was tall and gaunt, with a wild look about him that made my skin crawl. He asked for a ride, his voice low and raspy. I tried to refuse, to tell him that I couldn't take passengers, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. Reluctantly, I agreed to give him a lift, hoping to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. But as he climbed into the cab and settled into the passenger seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As we drove down the deserted highway, the hitchhiker grew increasingly agitated, his movements jerky and erratic. He kept glancing out the window as if he were expecting something or someone to appear out of the darkness. I tried to make small talk to keep the atmosphere light and friendly, but the hitchhiker didn't seem interested in conversation. He just stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the road with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, he pulled a knife from his pocket and pressed it against my throat. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was in mortal danger. He demanded that I pull over, his voice low and menacing. I knew I had to act fast if I wanted to survive. With trembling hands, I reached for the emergency button on my dashboard, hoping to summon help before it was too late. But before I could press it, the hitchhiker lunged at me, his knife slicing through the air with deadly precision. I managed to wrestle the knife away from him, but not before he landed a blow to my shoulder. Pain shot through me as I fought to keep control of the truck, my vision swimming with adrenaline and fear. Even as I struggled to maintain control, the hitchhiker kept coming at me, his eyes filled with madness. I knew I had to get him out of the cab before he killed me. With one final burst of strength, I slammed on the brakes and sent the truck skidding to a halt. The hitchhiker was thrown against the dashboard, giving me the opening I needed to push him out of the cab and onto the side of the road. As he lay there, stunned and disoriented, I seized the opportunity to escape. I climbed out of the cab and ran as fast as I could, putting as much distance between myself and the hitchhiker as possible. Then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw the lights of an approaching vehicle up ahead. With renewed determination, I flagged them down and begged for help, my hand shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. With their assistance, I was able to get to safety and receive medical attention for my injuries. It was a terrifying ordeal that I'll never forget, a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the darkness for those who dare to trust the wrong person.
I was house-sitting for my parents while they were away on vacation. Their home is in a quiet area of Pennsylvania, surrounded by trees and hills. It was supposed to be a peaceful week. The first few days passed without incident. I took care of the mail, watered the plants, and kept the house tidy. One night, as I was about to go to bed, I heard footsteps from upstairs. I paused, thinking it was probably just the old house settling, but the sound continued, slow and deliberate. I went upstairs to check, but there was no one there. I searched all the rooms, including the bathroom, but found nothing unusual. The footsteps seemed to have stopped, so I went back downstairs. I reassured myself it was probably just my imagination or the creaks of an old house. I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and went to bed. The sound didn't return that night, and though I slept fitfully, I managed to get some rest. The next morning, as I was making coffee, I noticed that the attic door was open. I didn't remember seeing it open before. The attic was a place I'd never really explored. My parents had kept it locked for as long as I could remember. It was odd to see it open now. I walked toward the attic door, which was at the end of the hallway. The door was heavy and dusty. I slowly pushed it open, revealing a narrow, steep staircase leading up. The hallway light didn't reach the attic, leaving it completely dark. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and cautiously climbed the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, the air thick with must and age. At the top, I swept the flashlight around. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten belongings. I moved carefully, shining the light over everything. There was nothing unusual, just old items covered in blankets and dust. I saw a rocking chair, some old trunks, and several cardboard boxes stacked in the corner. Nothing seemed out of place. Still feeling uneasy, I went back downstairs and closed the attic door. I checked all the windows and doors to make sure everything was secure. I didn't know why the attic door had been open, but I wanted to be certain it was locked this time. That evening, I felt tense. I kept hearing faint noises, like scratching or movement from above. I convinced myself it was just the house creaking again. I tried to stay calm and get some sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, my thoughts returned to the attic door. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, and it sounded like they were moving around, upstairs. I got up to investigate, but as I reached the top of the stairs, the sound stopped. The upstairs was silent. I checked every room, but everything appeared normal. When I returned to my room, I locked the door. I sat on the bed, trying to calm down. The noises didn't return, and eventually I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found the attic door open again. It was as if someone had been up there during the night. I went up to check again, but nothing had changed. The attic was just as I'd left it. I shivered as I closed the door once more. I called my parents and told them about the noises and the attic door opening. They were concerned, but reassured me that it was likely just the house making noises. They suggested I check all the locks and make sure everything was secure. I agreed and spent the rest of the day ensuring the house was as secure as possible. That night, I made sure to lock the attic door tightly, even placing a small chair against it for extra security. I went to bed, trying to ignore the growing fear twisting in my gut. The next few nights passed without incident. I didn't hear any more footsteps or strange sounds. It seemed like everything had stopped. My parents returned home, and I was relieved to hand the house back over to them. I never mentioned the noises or the attic door again. They were already worried enough, and I didn't want to add to their stress. I was just happy my time house sitting was over, and I could return to my own place. Looking back, I'm still not sure what happened. Maybe it really was just an old house making strange noises, or maybe someone was trying to scare me. I went for a walk at night, probably around 10:30 p.m., needing to clear my head. You know how it is. Life had been stressing me out, and I just needed to get out of the house. The park near my place is usually quiet at that hour. A few dim streetlights here and there, but mostly just the distant glow from the city. I figured it'd be a good place to think, with no distractions. The cool air and empty paths felt peaceful at first. Just the sound of my footsteps on the sidewalk and the occasional rustling of leaves. I started to feel better, finding my rhythm. There's something about the steady pace of running that helps organize my thoughts. After a while, though, I noticed something strange. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt off. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing, so I kept running. But the sense of not being alone clung to me, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I thought I could hear footsteps behind me, but when I stopped to listen, they stopped too. I stood there, catching my breath, listening hard, but all I heard was my own breathing. Shaking it off, I started running again, but that uneasy feeling came back right away, like someone was matching my pace just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was nothing, maybe just my own footsteps echoing, or some stray animal in the bushes, but it didn't feel right. I decided to pick up my pace to shake off the feeling. That's when I heard it, clear as day, footsteps right behind me, keeping perfect time with mine. My heart started pounding. I glanced back, but saw nothing, just the empty park behind me. The path was lit by old street lamps, casting long shadows, but no one was there. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was the wind or my own footsteps bouncing off the trees. But then I heard it again, louder this time, like whoever, or whatever, was speeding up. I didn't look back again. I just started running faster. My legs burned, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. I reached the edge of the park, where the path met the main road, and slowed down a bit, thinking I had imagined it all. But when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw a figure in the distance, just at the edge of the light. They stood there, silently watching me. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape, but I knew they had been following me. Panic surged through me, and I sprinted toward the road, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear them running behind me, closing the distance fast. Whoever it was, they were quick. I didn't dare look back again, just kept my eyes on the streetlights ahead, praying I'd reach the main road where there might be cars, people, anything to help. The footsteps behind me grew louder, pounding on the pavement. They were right behind me. My legs screamed in pain, and I felt like I was about to collapse, but I pushed on, faster. I could almost feel them reaching out, trying to grab me, and that fear pushed me even harder. Finally, I burst out of the park and onto the main road. Cars were passing by, and the sight was like a lifeline. I stumbled to a stop, chest heaving, looking around wildly for the person who had chased me, but there was no one. The dark park loomed behind me, empty and silent. I stood under the streetlight, shaking, sweat pouring down my face, but the figure was gone. I didn't stick around to see if they'd come back. I ran home as fast as I could, glancing over my shoulder the whole way, half expecting to see that dark shape again. But the streets were empty. When I finally got back to my apartment, my hands were trembling so badly I struggled to unlock the door. I locked it behind me and collapsed on the couch, trying to steady my breathing. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing there, just watching me from the darkness. I kept hearing those footsteps in my mind, pounding behind me, getting closer and closer. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, just standing there, watching me from the shadows. I left the lights on and checked the windows every few minutes, making sure no one was out there. I felt like I was losing my mind, like I could have imagined it all, but it had felt so real. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that whoever was in the park could still be out there, watching. I closed all the curtains and stayed inside all day, too scared to leave. Every little noise made me jump, and I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps that had chased me in the park. I haven't been back there since. I can't even walk past it without that feeling of dread rising in my chest. I keep telling myself it was just some creep messing with me, but it doesn't help. I can't forget how fast they were, how close they got. I've tried running elsewhere, but I can't shake the fear that someone's out there, watching me. I keep glancing over my shoulder, listening for footsteps that aren't there. I had rented a cabin in Vermont for the weekend, hoping to find some peace and quiet, far away from everything. The cabin was deep in the woods, completely isolated. When I arrived, it looked just like the pictures. Small but cozy, with a big fireplace and large windows that let in plenty of light. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. The first day was beautiful. I settled in, made myself a cup of coffee, and read by the fire. The only sounds were the crackling flames and the wind outside. It felt like I was the only person in the world. That night, I went to bed early. The bed was comfortable, the cabin was warm, but I couldn't fall asleep right away. I kept hearing noises outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe some animals moving through the woods, since the forest was full of life. But the noises were strange, slow, deliberate, like footsteps. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or something similar, but it was hard to ignore. Eventually, I drifted off after persuading myself that I was being foolish. The next morning, I felt a bit embarrassed about how worried I'd been. I made breakfast and decided to take a walk around the property to clear my head. The air was fresh, and everything was so still, as if the world had gone silent. But as I walked, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Muddy footprints leading up to the cabin. They weren't mine. I hadn't been outside in the mud since I arrived, and these prints were fresh. They led straight up to the back door and stopped there. I stared at them for a while, my mind racing to figure out where they had come from. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been outside the cabin last night, right near the door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I hurried back inside and locked the door behind me. I tried to stay calm, telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost, though I hadn't seen anyone since arriving. I decided not to let it ruin my day. I tried to relax, but every little noise outside put me on edge. That night, the noises started again, the same slow, steady sound of footsteps. I listened from bed, my heart pounding in my chest. They were closer this time, right outside the cabin. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. I was too scared of what I might see. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, praying for it to stop. Eventually, it did, but I couldn't sleep after that. I kept thinking about those footprints and how close they had been to the door. I felt like I was being watched. I got out of bed and double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Finally, I sat by the fire, trying to forget about everything. But the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. The next morning, I decided to leave the cabin for a bit, thinking I might feel better if I got out for a while. I drove into town, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. I had lunch, wandered around a few shops, and tried to enjoy the day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching me, but every time I turned around, there was no one there. When I returned to the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. More footprints, fresh ones, leading from the woods straight to my bedroom window. They were the same size as the ones I had seen before, deep and clear in the mud. Someone had been standing right outside my window, watching me while I was gone. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to leave, but it was getting dark, and the idea of driving through the woods alone at night scared me just as much. I decided to stay in the cabin but kept all the lights on and made sure every door and window was locked. I grabbed a kitchen knife and kept it close, just in case. I was on high alert, jumping at every little sound. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat on the couch listening and waiting. The footsteps returned, slow, steady, circling the cabin. I could hear them moving, occasionally stopping as if someone was trying to figure out a way in. I gripped the knife tightly, my hands shaking. I didn't know what they wanted or who they were, but I knew I wasn't alone. At some point, the footsteps stopped right outside the back door. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but all I heard was silence. Heavy, oppressive silence. Then the doorknob started to turn, slowly, as if someone was testing to see if it was locked. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The doorknob rattled for a few more seconds before stopping. I didn't hear anything after that. The footsteps were gone, but I knew they were still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. I stayed up all night, too terrified to move, too scared even to look out the window. I kept imagining those muddy footprints and the person who had left them, standing just outside, waiting for me to make a mistake. When the sun finally came up, I grabbed my things and left the cabin as fast as I could. I didn't care about the rest of the weekend. I just wanted to get out of there. I had ventured deep into the heart of the Australian outback, craving adventure and the thrill of the unknown. The vast, unforgiving desert stretched endlessly before me, and I relished the challenge of navigating its wild, untamed terrain. But as I pushed deeper into the wilderness, disaster struck. My car sputtered, coughed, and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. Panic gripped me as the reality of my isolation hit hard. The outback is no place to be stranded, and miles of desolation surrounded me in every direction. With no time to waste, I set out on foot, desperately hoping to stumble upon some sign of civilization, anything that could save me. But as I trudged under the relentless sun, the heat bore down on me, draining my energy and intensifying my thirst. The more I walked, the heavier my legs became, and the farther hope seemed to drift. Then, just as I was on the verge of collapse, I spotted figures on the horizon. Relief surged through me as I staggered toward them, convinced I'd found salvation. But as I drew closer, dread took its place. Those figures weren't human. It was a pack of dingoes, wild and feral, their eyes locked on me with predatory hunger. Fear shot through me like a lightning bolt. I was no longer just a traveler lost in the outback. I was prey. Alone, defenseless, and miles from help, I had no choice but to run. The snarls of the dingoes echoed behind me, growing louder as they gave chase. My heart pounded in my chest, the sun beating down like a furnace, but I pushed myself forward, sprinting through the desert, the sound of their snapping jaws too close for comfort. No matter how fast I ran, they were closing in. Their hot breath was on my heels and my legs were on fire, muscles screaming for me to stop, but I knew I couldn't afford to slow down. If I did, it would be the end. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, I spotted a rocky outcrop in the distance. It was my only chance. With what little strength I had left, I sprinted toward it, every step a battle against exhaustion. The rocks loomed closer, and I pushed myself harder, lungs burning as I finally reached the shelter. I collapsed onto the hard ground, gasping for breath, praying the dingoes had lost my scent. For a long moment, I lay there, trembling in the shadow of the rocks, listening for any sign of the pack. But all I heard was the eerie silence of the desert night as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into darkness. I knew I couldn't let my guard down, not for a second. I huddled in the shadows, too terrified to close my eyes, every rustle of the wind a potential threat. The night was endless, filled with unseen dangers, lurking just beyond the edges of the rocks. But somehow, as dawn broke, I was still alive. I emerged from my hiding place, weak, shaken, but breathing. The dingoes were gone, but the fear remained. I had narrowly escaped death in the outback, but its savage grip still lingered. I woke to the harsh flickering of lights in my apartment. a stuttering glow that danced erratically across the room. At first, I thought it was just a power surge, but as I blinked away the haze of sleep and sat up, a gnawing sense of dread crept over me. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The uneasy quiet of the apartment pressed in around me as I slid out of bed, my heart beginning to pound with each step. The hallway ahead was drenched in shadow, interrupted only by the sporadic flashing of the lights. As I cautiously peered into the darkness, I saw it, a figure just beyond the reach of the dim, failing bulbs. Its form was obscured, its features indiscernible, but the way it stood still, watching, sent ice down my spine. My blood ran cold. I was not alone. I froze, caught between the instinct to confront the intruder and the terror that kept me rooted in place. Every muscle in my body tensed as I stared at the figure, unsure if it had noticed me. Then, without warning, it turned and melted into the darkness, vanishing as if it had never been there. My breath hitched, and the oppressive silence returned, thicker than before. With shaking hands, I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 as my voice trembled, trying to convey the panic I felt to the operator. But even as I explained the situation, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the figure was still there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment. Each minute felt like an eternity as I paced back and forth, my eyes darting to every corner, every shadow, listening intently for the slightest sound. My breath quickened, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, they echoed through the hallway, growing louder with each step, closer with each breath. My heart thundered in my chest as I realized the figure was coming back. But this time they weren't alone. Backing away from the door, I scanned the room for an escape, but there was none. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside. My pulse roared in my ears as the lights flickered again, casting the hallway into pitch-black darkness. I braced myself, body trembling with fear, ready for whatever horror awaited me on the other side of that door. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours as the oppressive dark pressed in around me. And yet, nothing came. No sound. No movement. Just silence. I exhaled shakily, my breath ragged as I realized the footsteps had stopped. The figure, gone, vanished into the night like a ghost. I sank to the floor, the tension in my body slowly unraveling, but my heart still raced wildly. The terror of that night clung to me like a shadow, a creeping fear that I couldn't quite shake. The figure, the footsteps, they were real. And even though they had disappeared, the memory of them, the fear that gripped me, would never leave. I checked into a hotel outside Baton Rouge. The air was thick with humidity, and I was exhausted after a long day of driving. It was nothing special, just a one-story building with faded light blue paint and a flickering sign. But the price was cheap, which was my main concern at that moment. The woman at the front desk barely looked up when I handed her my card. She handed me the room key and pointed toward the end of the hallway without saying a word. The room was quite small, just a bed, a wall-mounted TV, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of bleach. I dropped my bag on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, too tired to think about finding another place to stay. After a quick shower, I got into bed, scrolling through my phone mindlessly. The room was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic on the highway. I felt uncomfortable, but told myself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings. I had been driving for hours, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Around midnight, I heard the first knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft tapping, like someone gently tapping their fingers against wood. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't expected anyone, and the hotel had been nearly empty when I checked in. I waited, hoping it was just a mistake, but the knocking continued, this time more insistent. I got out of bed, my feet sinking into the thin carpet, and slowly walked toward the door. I pressed my eye to the peephole but saw only darkness. No one was there. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I hesitated, unsure whether to open the door, ultimately convincing myself that there was nothing to worry about, maybe just a few kids playing pranks, and I turned back to bed. But not 5 minutes later, the knocking came again, this time louder, more urgent. I sprang up from the bed, my heart racing. I knew I should ignore it, but something inside me wanted to confront whoever was outside. I threw the blanket off and stepped to the door, flinging it open without looking through the peephole. The hallway was empty, no one in sight. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the overhead light, flickering as if it was about to go out at any moment. I stepped into the hallway, glancing left and right, but saw nothing. The other doors were all shut tight, and the place was eerily quiet. I closed the door and locked it tightly, checking the security chain once more. I tried to go back to bed to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My nerves were on edge, and every little noise startled me. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sign of movement. Just as I was beginning to drift off, the knocking sounded again, this time different, slow, deliberate, as if someone was purposely taunting me. I gritted my teeth, trying to force myself to lie still in bed, but the sound persisted, relentless and infuriating. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up, grabbed my phone, and rushed to the door, but before I could open it, I noticed something. A small piece of paper had been shoved under the door, barely visible in the dim light. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The paper was old, the edges yellowed as if it had been crumpled and smoothed out again. There was writing on it, scrawled and messy as if the writer had been in a hurry. It was just my name, nothing else, no message, no explanation, just my name. A chill ran down my spine. I looked toward the door, then back at the paper, my mind racing. How did they know my name? I hadn't spoken to anyone except the woman at the front desk, and she didn't seem like the prankster type. I peered through the peephole again, but the hallway remained empty. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told me to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, my mind spinning with possibilities. Was someone watching me? Had they followed me since I checked in? That thought sent a shiver down my spine. Finally, I forced myself to act. I opened my bag and stuffed my belongings in as quickly as I could, my hands shaking so much I could barely zip it up. I knew I had to get out of there, but the thought of opening the door again made me shudder. As I reached for the doorknob, the knocking began again, this time louder, almost frenzied, as if they were trying to break in. I stumbled back, dropping my bag and running into the bathroom. I locked the door behind me, my heart pounding in my ears. I sat on the edge of the tub, trying to control my breathing. The knocking continued, relentless and terrifying. I stared at the bathroom door, half hoping it would burst open at any moment. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I wasn't safe. Finally, the knocking stopped, and the silence that followed was even worse. I waited, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing, just the oppressive, suffocating silence. I was in the bathroom for hours, too terrified to move. When I finally gathered the courage to leave, I crept out of the bathroom, my eyes fixed on the door. There was no sound, no sign of anyone outside. The piece of paper with my name still lay on the floor where I had dropped it, a stark reminder of how real everything was. I picked up my bag and rushed to the door. This time, I didn't check the hallway. I just ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring as I drove out of the parking lot. I didn't look back, not wanting to know if anyone was watching me leave. All I could think about was putting as much distance between myself and that motel as possible. I drove for hours, my mind replaying the events of that night over and over. I got off the bus, thinking it was the right stop, twilight settling in as the light faded, quickly realizing I had made a mistake. The bus pulled away, dust rising, leaving me in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing around, just the empty roads stretching out in both directions, no buildings, no streetlights, nothing. I looked at my phone to check the map, but had no signal. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I could walk to the next stop or find a town ahead. It couldn't be that far, could it? But as I started walking, the feeling of dread welled up inside me. The road was too quiet, no cars, no sounds, just my footsteps on the pavement. I kept going, hoping to see some sign of life soon. After a while, I heard a vehicle approaching from behind. I turned around, initially feeling relieved, thinking I could hitch a ride, but as the vehicle got closer, it slowed down. It didn't pass me, it just matched my walking pace. I couldn't see who was driving. The headlights were too bright, blinding me. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe they were just being cautious, but the feeling was all wrong. My instincts were screaming. I quickened my pace, hoping they would get bored and drive away. But the vehicle stayed right behind me. That was when the real fear began. I glanced over my shoulder again, and the vehicle was still there, shadowing me like a ghost. I decided to pick up the pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The vehicle continued to follow, the engine humming as it rolled beside me. I thought about running, but the road was too open, nowhere to hide, just the vast desert stretching out on either side. If I ran, they could easily catch up. I tried to think of another plan, but my mind was racing, unable to focus. Suddenly, the vehicle accelerated and pulled in front of me, blocking my path. The door swung open, and I saw a man step out. He was tall, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He stood there for a moment just staring at me, and I froze. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. He called to me, his voice too calm, asking if I needed a ride. I shook my head, trying to keep my distance, but he stepped closer. I said I was fine, that I was just going to keep walking, but he didn't seem to care about what I was saying. There was something in his voice that sent chills down my spine. I took a step back, and that was when he lunged at me. I turned and ran as fast as I could. I heard him yell something, but I didn't stop to listen. My legs were burning. My lungs felt like they were on fire, but I kept running without daring to look back. The sound of the engine roared behind me. I knew he was chasing me, tires screeching as he tried to catch up. I veered off the road, stumbling into the desert, hoping the rough terrain would slow him down. The ground was uneven, rocks and bushes tripping me up, but I didn't stop. I could hear the vehicle crashing through the brush, the headlights slicing through the night, getting closer. I saw a small hill ahead and ran toward it. My only thought was to get out of sight. I climbed over the rocks, my hands scraping against the sharp edges, but I didn't care. I just needed to hide. I dropped down on the other side, praying he wouldn't find me. I lay there, listening to the engine roar as it circled around, my heart racing, barely breathing. After what felt like hours, the sound finally faded into the distance. I lay there in the dark, trembling, terrified to move. I didn't know if he was gone for good or just waiting. I stayed there until the sun began to rise, the first light of dawn breaking the horizon, and only then did I dare to peek out. The road was empty, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I climbed back to the top of the hill, trying to figure out where I was. I could see the road stretching out before me, the early morning light painting the landscape in soft colors. There was still no sign of the vehicle, and I knew I had to get to safety. As I picked my way down the hill, I heard something behind me, a faint sound, almost like the whisper of wind, but it was different, more sinister. I turned around and froze. Standing at the top of the hill was the man, the same baseball cap shading his face, just watching me. A cold dread seeped into my bones. My feet wouldn't move, and I felt paralyzed, like a deer caught in headlights. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest, and he stepped forward, a twisted grin breaking across his face. I turned and ran again, but this time I didn't look back. One night I was working late at the office. It was just 9 p.m., and the building was nearly empty. I was finishing up a report that was due the next day, and the office was eerily silent, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of paper. Finally, when I completed my work, I decided it was time to go home. I packed my things and headed to the elevator. I pressed the button and waited. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and I stepped in, relieved to be heading home. Just as the doors were about to close, another man hurriedly stepped inside. I glanced at him and noticed he seemed disheveled, as if he had just run or something, with wrinkled and slightly dirty clothes, and his eyes appeared wild. I tried to ignore him and focused on the numbers lighting up as the elevator started moving. Suddenly, the elevator jolted and the lights flickered out. I felt a wave of panic as the light completely disappeared for a few seconds. When the lights came back on, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The man's hands were stained with what looked like blood. Not just a small amount, but a lot. My mind raced. I wanted to say something, to ask if he was okay, but I couldn't find the words. I just stood there, trying to keep calm. The man seemed to sense my unease. He looked at me with wide, unblinking eyes, and I could see fear in his expression, as if he were trapped in his own world, unable to focus on anything else. The elevator stopped again, and the lights flickered once more. I could hear the soft buzzing of the emergency light above. The man took a deep breath, and I noticed his hands were trembling. He glanced around the elevator and then looked at me as if trying to comprehend something. "Is something wrong?" I finally managed to ask, trying to keep my voice steady. My throat felt dry, and my heart raced in my chest. He didn't respond right away, just stared at me, and I could see his eyes darting around as if he were trying to remember something. The silence in the elevator was deafening. I wanted to hit the emergency button, but my hands felt heavy. After what felt like an eternity, he said, "They're coming." His voice was shaky. "They'll find me." I didn't understand what he meant. "Who's coming?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I could see the fear in his eyes, and it only made me more anxious. He didn't answer, but began pacing the small space, his bloodied hands flailing noisily. Occasionally, he would stop and stare at the elevator doors as if waiting for them to open at any moment. I tried to stand as far away from him as possible, my mind racing to come up with a plan. The thought of what he might have done or who might be after him made me shiver. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I needed to stay calm and avoid provoking him. The elevator jolted again, and the lights flickered even more this time. I heard a faint noise from somewhere above, and the elevator stopped. My heart raced, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I tried to press the emergency button, but it seemed to be unresponsive. The man's breathing became heavier, more erratic. He appeared to be experiencing some sort of crisis. I could see his gaze darting around the elevator, and he was mumbling to himself. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his tone was desperate and frantic. I knew I needed to get out of there, but the elevator wasn't moving. I looked around, trying to find something that could help, but the emergency phone in the elevator was broken. I felt completely trapped. The thought of being stuck there with someone who could be dangerous was terrifying. Suddenly, the man stopped and turned to me, his eyes wide, as if he was about to say something. But then he just leaned against the wall and slid down to the floor, his back resting against the elevator wall. His breathing was heavy, and he seemed exhausted. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I waited what felt like a century before hearing the faint sounds of rescuers talking outside the elevator shaft. I could only hear bits and pieces, but the sound brought me a glimmer of hope. Finally, the elevator doors began to open slowly, lights spilling in from the hallway, and I saw a group of rescuers at the door. They looked at the man sitting on the floor, then glanced at me, and I could see the concern in their eyes. One of the rescuers stepped inside to check on the man, while another helped me out of the elevator. They asked me questions, but I was too panicked to answer properly. I just pointed at the man and said he needed help. They took charge of the situation, carefully assessing it. The man remained sitting on the floor, his hands still covered in blood. I couldn't tell if he was dangerous or not. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I was led out of the building. Later, I learned that the man had been arrested and taken to the hospital. It turned out he had been involved in a violent incident, and the blood on his hands was from that. The police handled everything from there. Occasionally, I still think about that night, the feeling of being trapped in the elevator with an unstable person, not knowing what would happen next. It's something I can't forget. I parked my car in the basement of an underground garage just after 11 p.m. It was one of those massive concrete structures where sound seemed to be swallowed up. My footsteps echoed against the walls as I made my way to the elevator. The place was almost empty, with only a few scattered cars, and most of the lights were either flickering or completely out. The air smelled stale, like old exhaust and rainwater, which always gave me a chill. But this was Seattle, and finding street parking at such a late hour was impossible, so I had no other choice. I had been out for dinner with a few friends, nothing too extravagant. When I returned to the garage, it was even quieter than before, as if the entire place was holding its breath. I stepped out of the elevator on the lower floor where I had parked. The sound of my heels echoed loudly against the concrete, too loud for the silence. I looked around, expecting to see my car in its spot, but it wasn't there. I stood there for a moment, confused. Maybe I had the wrong floor. That had to be it. I walked down the rows, checking the other side as well, but my car was nowhere to be found. My heart started beating a little faster. It was a silly mistake, but I was sure I had parked here. I was tired. Maybe I'd just confused myself. I went back to the elevator and tried another floor, but still, no car. The anxiety in my gut began to grow. I knew I wasn't wrong. I could clearly picture where I had parked, right by the flickering light near the far wall, but the spot was empty. I pulled out my phone to call someone, but the signal was weak down here. The bars kept flickering, coming and going. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it must be a mix-up, or maybe the car had been towed by mistake. I started walking around the garage, checking row after row, but it was all empty, just shadows and cold concrete. As I walked, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In one of the darker corners, just beyond a broken light, I saw something move. Not much, just a faint shift in the shadows, like someone was standing there, watching me. I froze, squinting into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything clearly. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something or someone step out of the shadows, but the corner remained still. I quickened my pace, the sound of my heels clicking faster on the concrete. I just wanted to find my car and get out of there. I reached the end of the garage and turned back, thinking maybe I'd missed something. That's when I saw him, a man standing a few rows away, just barely illuminated by one of the dim lights. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and staring directly at me. My heart nearly stopped. I couldn't make out his face, but there was something about the way he stood so still that made my blood run cold. For a moment, I thought about calling out to him, asking if he had seen anything, but something inside me told me not to. Instead, I turned around and walked quickly in the opposite direction, hoping he would leave me alone. I didn't hear footsteps, but I could feel his eyes on me, drilling into the back of my neck. I kept walking, trying to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I needed to find my car to get to safety. I checked each row, each corner, but the garage felt like a maze, and I was getting more and more lost. The man was no longer in sight, but that only made things worse. I knew he was still somewhere in the darkness, watching. My breath started coming faster, and I felt the panic rising in my chest. I tried to come up with a plan, something to get out of this. I decided to head for the exit, thinking maybe I could find a security guard or someone who could help. But as I neared the exit, I saw the same man standing by the door, waiting. He was closer now, and I could see his face. It was blank, almost expressionless, but there was something cold in his eyes that sent chills down my spine. I stopped, unsure of what to do. He didn't move, just stood there, blocking the exit. I turned and hurried back into the garage, not caring about the noise my heels were making anymore. The only thought in my head was to get away from him. But the deeper I went, the more lost I felt. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness growing thicker. My car was nowhere to be seen, and I knew I was running out of time. I heard footsteps behind me, at first light, then louder. He was following me. I broke into a run, not caring if he heard me, my heels slamming against the concrete as I sprinted past rows of cars, my breath coming in gasps. I didn't dare look back, too scared of what I might see. I rounded a corner, trying to put as much distance between us as I could, but the footsteps were getting closer. My chest tightened, panic gripping me. I knew I couldn't run forever. I had to find a way out, somewhere to hide, anything. Suddenly, I spotted a maintenance door, slightly ajar at the end of a row. I bolted for it, pulling the door open and slipping inside just as the footsteps rounded the corner behind me. I gently closed the door, pressing my back against it and holding my breath. I was in a small, dark room filled with tools and cleaning supplies, the air thick with the smell of chemicals. I listened, straining to hear anything outside, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. I stood there, motionless, for what felt like hours, every sound making me jump, every creak of the building, convincing me he was right outside. I didn't know if he had seen me, if he was waiting for me to come out or if he had already left, but I couldn't stay there forever. Slowly, I cracked the door open, just a sliver, peeking out into the garage. It was empty, the rows of cars stretching out in eerie silence. I didn't see him, but that didn't make me feel any safer. I slipped out of the room, staying low, and started making my way toward the nearest exit. My car was gone. I knew that now. Maybe it had been stolen, towed, or maybe something else entirely. I couldn't worry about that anymore. I just needed to get out. As I neared the exit, I scanned the area, my heart pounding in my throat. I didn't see him, and the doors were in sight, just a few more steps. I forced myself to keep moving, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. Just as I reached the door, I heard a sound behind me, the slow scrape of a shoe on concrete. I didn't dare turn around, couldn't. I pushed the door open and stepped into the stairwell, nearly leaping down the steps 2 at a time. I could hear him right behind me, his footsteps echoing in the stairwell. I burst out onto the street, the cool night air hitting me like a shock. I didn't stop running until I was several blocks away, among the lights and sounds of the city. Only then did I dare to look back, but the street was empty, no sign of him anywhere. I hailed a taxi and climbed in, my hands shaking as the car pulled away. I couldn't help but glance back at the garage, half expecting to see him standing at the entrance, watching me go, but there was nothing.
I had settled in to prepare for bed on a late evening, just like any other day in my small apartment in New York. I was tired after a long day at work and wanted to relax. The noise of the city outside, ambulance sirens, distant voices, and the sound of traffic was something I had grown accustomed to. Despite the chaos, it provided a sense of safety, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this vast city. Around 11:30 p.m., my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I usually don't answer calls from unknown numbers, but this time something compelled me to pick up. On the other end was a man's voice, trembling and gasping. He kept repeating, they're coming, you need to leave now." I was startled, but I still thought it might just be a prank or someone calling the wrong number. I told him he had dialed the wrong person and hung up, trying to return to my routine. About 10 minutes later, the phone rang again, still the same number. I hesitated for a moment but decided to answer. The man's voice on the other end was now more frantic, almost shouting, "Listen to me, they're coming for you. You need to leave right now." I could hear his labored breathing, as if he were running or hiding. At that moment, I started to feel a chill down my spine, but I still tried to convince myself it was just a bizarre joke. I hung up again, but the feeling of unease lingered. I turned on the TV to distract myself, but my gaze kept drifting back to the phone, waiting for another call. And then it rang again. This time, I didn't answer and let it go to voicemail. The call stopped, but just a minute later, I received a notification for a new voicemail. I hesitated for a moment before pressing play. The message was very brief, but his voice was filled with terror. "They've arrived, you don't have much time, they're coming up, hide now." My heart began to race. This was no longer a joke, it felt all too real. I stood up, looking around my apartment. I was alone, but now I felt like I was being watched, threatened. I walked to the front door and checked the lock, then checked again. As I stood there, my phone rang once more, and my stomach dropped. I didn't want to answer, but a part of me felt compelled to do so. Before I could say anything, I heard a noise from the other side. The door creaked, footsteps approached, and then a whisper, "They're almost here." The call abruptly cut off. An indescribable fear urged me to look through the peephole. I leaned in close, trying to steady my breathing. At first, I saw nothing but an empty hallway. But then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, gradually getting closer to my door. I stood still, listening as they came nearer, then stopped right in front of my door. I dared not look again. The world outside seemed eerily silent. I slowly backed away from the door, trying not to make a sound. My apartment was small, leaving little room to hide. My heart raced, and my mind spun as I thought about what to do. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, the only thing that made me feel slightly safer. I retreated to the corner of the living room where I could see part of the front door while still hiding in the shadows. I waited, gripping the knife so tightly it hurt. Every tiny sound in the building startled me. Then I heard it, a very faint sound, almost unnoticeable, the sound of something scraping against the door. Someone was trying to unlock my front door. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, standing still as stone. The scraping stopped, and then the doorknob began to jiggle. I stared at it, my body frozen in terror as I watched the knob slowly turn. Fortunately, the deadbolt was locked, and the door didn't open. However, the intruders outside weren't giving up. I heard them mumbling, but their words were too quiet to make out. My heart raced so loudly I thought they might hear it from outside. My mind raced with questions. Who were they? Why were they after me? Who was the caller, and how did he know? I continued to stand frozen, trying to remain calm. Then the silence was broken by another set of footsteps. There was more than one person outside. Two voices began to argue, their tones low but urgent. One of them said, "We need to hurry." At that moment, I realized I didn't have much time left. If they got in, I wouldn't stand a chance. My body was tense with sheer fear, but I knew I had to do something quickly. Suddenly, I remembered the emergency exit outside the bedroom window. That was my only chance. I slowly moved, trying not to make a sound as I backed toward the bedroom. The noises from the living room now felt distant, even though they were very close. They tried to open the door again, this time more forcefully, and I heard the door creaking under pressure. I knew I didn't have much time. Once in the bedroom, I went straight to the window. My heart pounded so hard I felt like it might burst. I gently opened the window, praying it wouldn't creak. The window opened, and a cold draft rushed in. I tightly gripped the knife and began to climb out through the emergency exit. Just as my foot landed on the metal rungs, I heard the front door of my apartment burst open. They were inside. I had no choice but to climb down quickly. I moved as fast as I could on the metal steps, my hands shaking from fear and cold. Voices echoed inside the apartment, they were looking for me. I was just a few meters from the ground when I heard the bedroom door swing open. I looked up and saw two men standing in the doorway, their cold eyes fixated on me. They didn't say anything, they just stared like predators that had spotted their prey. I continued to climb down, my heart pounding in my chest. When my feet hit the ground, I started running, not daring to look back. My footsteps echoed in the dark alley, and I only stopped when I saw the bright lights of the main road and heard the voices of strangers on the street. At that moment, I let out a sigh of relief and pulled out my phone, trembling as I called the police. The police arrived shortly after, but when we returned to the apartment, they had vanished. My front door was broken, and the apartment was in disarray, but nothing had been taken. The officer said it might have been a burglary, but I knew better, they hadn't come to steal, they had come for me. Someone had warned me, but I would never know who it was or how they knew those intruders would come. Since that night, I could no longer feel safe in my own apartment. I moved away a few months later, but the fear still clung to me, refusing to fade. I would never forget the feeling of standing by the bedroom window and the gaze of those two strangers. They had come for me, and to this day, I still don't know why. After I moved, I thought the fear would gradually diminish. But every time darkness fell, a sense of unease washed over me. Strange dreams plagued me, sometimes filled with footsteps outside my door, other times with whispers on the phone. In my dreams, I always found myself standing before the door of my old apartment, hands trembling, hearing the sound of the door creaking as someone tried to unlock it. And then, when the door swung open, I would see two shadowy figures standing there, staring at me with haunting eyes. Each time I woke up, drenched in cold sweat, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that even when I was awake, I didn't feel at peace. For months after moving into my new apartment, I constantly felt like someone was watching me. When I stepped outside, I would often subconsciously look around, searching for a strange figure in the crowd. Whenever my phone rang, my heart would race, fearing I would hear that trembling voice warning me once more. Every small sound, from the creak of a window to footsteps in the hallway, startled me. I tried to convince myself that it was all over. That those intruders couldn't find me at my new address, that I had escaped that danger. But a part of me couldn't believe it. Sometimes, when I walked into my new apartment after a long day at work, I would feel that strange sensation returning, an inexplicable unease, just like that night when I discovered my favorite mug had been moved. The only difference was that this time, I hadn't noticed anything changed in the apartment, but I always had the feeling that someone had been there before me. One night, As I was getting ready for bed, my phone suddenly vibrated. I looked at the screen and realized it was another unknown number. My stomach twisted with fear. I didn't answer. Instead, I let it go to voicemail. When the voicemail notification came in, I sat frozen, hesitating whether to listen or not. Finally, I gathered my courage and pressed play. That familiar trembling voice echoed, "They're coming again. This time, don't run." I threw my phone to the floor in panic. A sense of numbness enveloped me. What did that mean? Was I not supposed to run this time? Were they coming for me again? Suddenly, there was a soft knock on my front door, and I felt fear clearer than ever before. Who was standing out there? I didn't want to know. But deep down, I realized this wasn't the end. They were still looking for me. And this time, I wasn't sure I would escape. The overwhelming sense of terror rendered me motionless, my eyes glued to the door. The gentle knocking echoed again, steady like the slow beating of my heart, but the sound grew clearer, as if the person on the other side was waiting for me to respond. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but all my senses were stretched to the limit. A thought flashed through my mind: if I open the door this time, what will await me? I stood up, my hands trembling as I reached for the knife from the dining table, just like before. My heart pounded as I approached the door, my legs feeling heavy with each step. The sounds outside completely faded away, leaving only a deathly silence. I crouched down to look through the peephole, but all I saw was an empty hallway. No one was there. I swallowed hard and stepped back, wondering if I was imagining all of this. But something inside me said this wasn't a hallucination. They had come. I turned to lock the door again, but another noise made me stop. A faint sound came from behind me, from inside the apartment. I turned my head, my eyes following the direction of the noise towards the bedroom, where it originated. It was a whisper, like fabric rubbing together or a soft breath in the dark. No way. I had checked all the locks on the doors and windows. How could anyone have gotten in? I must be imagining it. But my feet instinctively led me closer to the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and a part of me wanted to run from this place, but curiosity, and the fear of being watched, pushed me forward. Standing before the bedroom door, I held my breath and gently pushed it open. The room was pitch dark, but the light from the hallway was enough for me to realize something was off. The bedroom window was still closed, the curtains were silent. But the air in the room felt heavier. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something, or someone, was present in the darkness. I scanned the room, seeing nothing unusual. But as my gaze swept past the closet, I heard it, a small but distinct sound of something shifting lightly. The whisper I had heard before. I felt a cold shiver down my back, and immediately memories from before flooded back. The sight of opening the closet and seeing a stranger lurking, the one who had lunged at me. My grip tightened on the knife, and my breaths became shorter, more frantic. Had they gotten in? Had they snuck in here while I wasn't paying attention? This time, I didn't wait. I shoved the closet door open. It creaked as it swung wide. But inside, it was empty. I let out a sigh of relief, my heart racing but feeling slightly calmer. I was panicking over nothing. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after everything that had happened. I closed the closet and turned to head back to bed to rest. But then, from the corner of the room, I heard laughter, soft, low, and haunting. A strange laughter I had never heard before, but it echoed in the space as if it belonged to this room for a long time. My body froze. I turned around, staring into the corner of the room, where the light from the hallway didn't reach, just thick darkness. And in that darkness, eyes were staring straight at me. I stood frozen, unable to believe my eyes. Those eyes, cold and soulless, like two black stones, were staring at me from the dark corner of the room. A wave of panic surged, paralyzing me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The soft laughter echoed again, this time clearer, like a mocking, haunting sound. I raised the knife instinctively, knowing it wouldn't help. "Do you think you can escape?" A whispering voice rang out from the darkness. The sound was low, as if it was speaking from deep inside my mind. "We have always been here. From the very beginning, we have been waiting for you." I took a step back, my breath quickening, trying to steady myself. Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling, but there was no response. Instead, the darkness began to move. No, not darkness, it was a shadow, a figure gradually stepping out from the corner of the room. It was tall, but its shape was indistinct, as if made from the very night itself. I took a deep breath, trying to regain my composure, but my heart raced as if it could explode. I don't know who you are, but you can't do anything to me. I shouted, my voice a mix of defiance and fear. The figure didn't answer, but it continued to approach, slowly yet surely. Then, other sounds emerged from behind me, footsteps, many footsteps, as if a group of people were entering my apartment. My heart nearly stopped. I turned around, and in front of me, the bedroom door stood wide open. In the dim light of the hallway, I saw other shapes, not human, but shadows similar to the entity in the room. They glided silently, but their presence made the air thick and cold. Don't resist, that voice echoed again, this time sounding closer, as if it were right next to me. We have found you, and this time, you cannot escape. I recoiled, but an invisible hand grabbed my shoulder, pulling me closer. I felt its cold breath on my skin. In a moment of desperation, I lunged the knife forward, but it sliced only through the air. Those entities had no physical form for me to fight against. No, it can't be, I whispered, almost praying. But deep down, I knew I was wrong. They had caught up with me. And this time, there was no escape. The laughter hissed one last time before the darkness completely swallowed me. And then, everything faded into nothingness.